Yes, I am Ed Bellis, and I am the co-founder and CTO of a company called Kenna Security. We're in the vulnerability management space. I'm not going to get too much into that at all today. We were acquired last year by Cisco, and I have spent the last 30 years or so in the technology space, and specifically the last 20 within cybersecurity. So prior to co-founding Kenna, I was the Chief Information Security Officer at a company called Orbitz, an online travel company. You may know them. Prior to that, I worked in security at Bank of America. I've worked in very large companies, very small companies, almost entirely focused, certainly over the last couple decades, on cybersecurity. So I was talking to Hiram just a few days ago about this presentation, and he gave me two pieces of advice. He said, Ed, I'll tell you what, one thing you're definitely going to want to do is go as deep into the technical weeds as possible. And if you can include any sort of math, that would be a bonus. So I'm going to oblige. A little bit of a background. So we're going to mostly focus on cybersecurity as it relates to logistics, but there's a whole breadth of information out there. Some of the data that I'm talking about is from a research report that came out of a company called Scientia. We actually do a lot of joint research with Scientia at Kenna. They are a data research company specifically focused in the cybersecurity space. And I mention that because they published, and actually this slide is now outdated because they just published a new report yesterday afternoon, jerks. But it's, what we're looking at here is this is over 1,100 breach events specifically within the logistics NACS codes or industry codes, and over a 1.4 billion in non-inflation adjusted damages. That's actually gone up, obviously, as you would imagine, given the new report that came out yesterday. What they're doing is they're gathering a bunch of data from breaches either through public disclosures, through insurance companies, through scraping of Freedom of Information Act requests, all of this to gather a whole lot of data about breaches, how they occur in some cases, who they affect, what the damages are, et cetera. So if you ever want some nighttime reading, post your cybersecurity lunch talk, feel free to download this report. It's free. So let's take a step back. This presentation is mostly going to be about a breach event that probably many people in this room actually have heard of. It's from a few years back, and it affected some very large logistics companies. And there's a lot of detail about that breach event that's occurred that allows us to speak more about it intelligently, right? But first, before we can do that, we got to take a step back and a preamble. So this all goes back to 2015, and now we know a lot about the war, certainly between Russia and Ukraine, but this was going on back in 2015 as well. And in this case, the physical war was occurring mostly in eastern Ukraine. But there was also an awful lot of cyber attacks that were going on from Russia to Ukraine. And they were mostly very specific, targeting things like power plants, power outages. They targeted some financial institutions and banks within the Ukraine. So a lot of this was happening back in 2015. And lo and behold, about a year later, there was a leak that came out on the internet. And it was from somebody called the Shadow Brokers, which nobody knew of at the time who they were or what they were doing. Originally, it was thought that maybe this was some leftover information from the Edward Snowden leaks that probably everybody in this room is probably familiar with. But it turned out Shadow Brokers is actually affiliated directly with Russia. I'm not going to go into some of the silly names that we get into in cybersecurity about we actually have code names for each of these threat actor groups. Russia happens to be Fancy Bear. There's also a nickname for a group inside of the National Security Agency called the Equations Group, and there's a whole lot of other things. So they're looking at China, Russia, they'll look at the US, Iran, North Korea, etc. That said, This toolkit that was published by the shadow brokers turned out to be a catalog called the ANT catalog. And you can think of this catalog as, hey, here are a bunch of ways to hack a bunch of different types of technology. We got things for Windows, we got things for firewalls, we got things for iPhones, you name it. And this was an internal catalog to the National Security Agency. So when somebody needed that to actually exploit or attack a particular, or essentially hack any of those types of devices, they could use that. They had things that you could plug into your USB port, so that if I'm sitting in a hotel room next to your laptop and it has this thing plugged into your USB, it will record all of your typing and then send that over the air to my machine so I can see exactly what you're typing. Another one that did all screen scraping, so I could see everything that you were looking at on your computer. They had one for an iPhone. I could download everything that was on your iPhone, whether it be texts, whether it be contacts, whether it be communications over the wire, or excuse me, over the wireless. All kinds of different things that I could do there. The point was that there's this very sensitive information, a catalog of attacks from the NSA that was published by shadow brokers. And a lot of people want to figure out why. In addition, there was a piece of that, and why I'm telling you this story is because it fits into ultimately this breach that we're going to talk about. And that is, there was something called Eternal Blue. And what Eternal Blue was a hack specifically geared towards Microsoft Windows. I won't go into the details. It was on the SMB protocol, yada, yada. The important part to know is if I was able to successfully use this Eternal Blue hack, I could completely take over your Windows machine, run any code that I want on it without you knowing that that code is actually running. It's very important. Ultimately, this got coded into a virus called WannaCry, which maybe a lot of people around here have heard about. WannaCry ended up being a very big ransomware event, right? And they started to publish that, and this all spread using this hack called Eternal Blue that was published by the shadow brokers. Here's the WannaCry timeline. So it was interesting because it gets published by shadow brokers. This was, again, going all the way back to 2016 at this point. We don't know exactly when those NSA tools were stolen or when that catalog was stolen, but it gets published, or the shadow brokers show up in August of 2016, and then they start by publishing just 2 exploits. One for a Cisco firewall and one for a Fortinet firewall. And they said, hey, if you want to see more, send us $1 million in Bitcoin and we'll publish the whole thing. Nothing happens except Microsoft gets wind, and this is a piece of the story that I'm unaware of how they got wind, but Microsoft gets wind that this Eternal Blue hack is in there. The NSA had talked, I believe the NSA had told Microsoft this, and for the first time in history, does anybody know what Microsoft Patch Tuesday is in the room? So Patch Tuesday has been this thing that's been going on for years now from Microsoft. They've done a really good job of this. Is what they do is every single month they'll send out an update that fixes a whole bunch of bugs, typically security bugs inside of Microsoft software. IT admins around the world then download this update, they push it out through their patch management systems, and they fix all of these security holes. For the very first time in history, Microsoft cancels Patch Tuesday. And it's because they immediately have to pick up their resources and focus on fixing this Eternal Blue problem. They recognize how bad that this could be if it gets out. So they do that, they cancel it, they publish a patch, a fix for this vulnerability, if you will, in March of 2017. At the same time, we start to see just before that, the first samples of WannaCry are already out there, right? So there's a website called VirusTotal that's run by Google. And what they do is basically collect samples. you're an IT admin, you work in security, you discover something that looks like a virus on a machine, you upload this to VirusTotal, it scans it, checks it out, and if it's seen anything else like that, you'll know if you actually have a virus on this machine. It's usually automated. Lots of people are doing this in the background as well. That said, we see the first upload of WannaCry before the patch came out. So a little bit of jargon. There's something called a zero-day vulnerability, and they're very rare in security, but they do happen. And what they really mean by this is there is an exploit, there is a hack, there is some sort of weaponized code out there that could take advantage of a software vulnerability that there is no fix for, there is no patch for. Microsoft, Adobe, whoever the vendor is, they have not published a fix for it, usually because they don't know about it, right? So this becomes officially a zero-day because there is a way to exploit and attack these machines, and there's no way for an administrator to fix those machines and prevent it from happening. So this comes out. They eventually push the patch out in March, and then as you see, we get the WannaCry outbreak begins May 12th. So that is about a month and a half to 2 months later, after the patch is out and available for everybody to apply, you see a massive outbreak across the internet for WannaCry. We'll talk about later as to why that is and why that's actually not rare at all. So that's one of the pieces of the puzzle to ultimately this breach. So we have this very serious vulnerability in Windows. A patch has become available for it, but I could essentially, if it is an unpatched machine, I can completely take it over. I can run whatever I want on your machine, and you would not know about it. However, there's another piece of software out there. This piece of software is called Mimikatz. Now, Mimikatz was actually developed by a French security researcher, and I'm going to blank on the year, and I'm going to say it's also probably not important on the year. But what this does is it took advantage of another hole within Microsoft's Windows products. What Microsoft's Windows products would do is essentially, I'm on my laptop, I might have access to some shared drives, I might have access to some other network resources within my environment. Well, I don't want you to have to type in your password every time you access the shared drive, then type in your password again every time you access this. So it would store your username and password in memory. That itself is not a problem. It's actually kind of a common thing that happens quite a bit. However, for this case, those were all stored in clear text, not encrypted. Well, this researcher discovered that and created this tool to effectively scrape that, which then tells me, once I'm on your machine, I know your username and password to other machines that you have access to. So keep both of these tools in mind as we start to talk a little bit more about what happened. Has anyone heard of NotPetya? Okay. So again, this is going back to the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. We're now in 2017. And what has happened is there's been several attacks that have happened that, again, were very precise, very pinpointed, targeted attacks against banks, against energy companies, etc. However, this next attack was one that was probably clever, but also either intentionally malicious or intentionally sloppy. And I'll talk about why. Anyone know who the Linkos group is? I didn't think so. I didn't know who the Linkos group was until I heard about this. So in Ukraine, there's a company, a software company called Linkos. And what Linkos does is they develop a whole bunch of different software products, as software companies do. But one of those pieces of software was something called Medoc. And what Medoc was you can think of it as the QuickBooks and TurboTax of Ukraine. So any business, anybody who needs to file taxes in Ukraine, if they're doing it electronically, they are likely using Medoc. Medoc was run by Linkos. Linkos had an office in Kyiv, and they had not a data center, but probably what I would consider a server closet, right? So they got a server closet, couple racks in there, pizza box style servers sitting in those. One of those pizza box sized servers was an update server. So what an update server does is it essentially, remember we talked about Patch Tuesday and pushing out updates and patches. What this update server did was anytime there was software updates, new features that needed to go out for MEDOC, bug fixes that needed to go out for MEDOC, etc., they were all on this update server. And if you had MEDOC running on your laptop, it would call out to that update server and say, hey, do you have anything new for me? And if it did, it would install it, and suddenly I would have new features, bugs would go away, performance would get better, whatever the case might be. Except in this case, Russia had found a way into that update server. And they had uploaded, essentially, a virus that used those two things, right? So it took Eternal Blue, that zero-day vulnerability that allows me to run code on your Windows machine, and it also took Mimikatz. And so what it did was said, hey, I'm going to get onto a machine, and the way I'm going to get onto that machine is anybody who's running this MEDOC software, when they get their software update, they'll download it, and suddenly it's on their machine. From there, I'm going to do two things. I'm going to scan the network, and I'm going to look for any other Windows machine that has this Windows vulnerability on it, and I'm going to jump on there and run code over there. But you know what? Maybe you've patched. I might have missed something. Well, what other machines does this user have access to? Well, I'm going to use Mimikatz, and I'm going to look at all your username and passwords and what machines you have access to, and I'm just going to log in as you and do the same thing. So effectively, I've got two different ways to get on all of the machines on your network once I am in. Anyone in this room heard of Maersk? All right, we got a winner. This is the Maersk headquarters in lovely Copenhagen. Large business in the logistics space, 8 business units, 574 offices, over 80,000 employees across 130 countries. Of those 80,000 employees, one, and exactly one, was running MEDOCs. And so my assumption is that employee had some sort of financial responsibility that included paying taxes in Ukraine. Well, that code was downloaded onto that machine for that particular employee in Maersk, and it immediately started running, and it immediately started looking for other machines on the network that had this vulnerability, and it immediately started logging in as that person on every single machine that that person had access to. So one of the IT administrators who was interviewed later would describe the scenario in Copenhagen at the headquarters as they're looking across all of these cubicles and all of these monitors. They all started one by one, every other second, flashing this black screen with red text on it. Imagine it all the way across your entire office in a matter of 30 to 60 seconds. They started scrambling. They actually had started to run around and try to unplug machines as it was happening to get off the network as quickly as possible before it happened to them. In some cases, they were jumping over turnstiles, not to be fast, but because the turnstiles had been hit and they were locked and they were encrypted. And this thing showed up everywhere, and it was incredibly fast, maybe even faster than the attacker thought it would be. But it had this, and it basically, it looks like your standard ransomware screen. Oops, your files have all been encrypted. Please pay us $300 worth of Bitcoin. We'll give you that decryption key, and you can get your data back. Except after analyzing this, this wasn't really ransomware at all. Your data was gone. This was a wiper. They had no interest. Some people probably tried to pay the ransom, probably did pay the ransom. Nobody got their data back. It was gone. So this started affecting their headquarters. It started affecting all of their other offices as well. And a lot of people started looking at this, and they're thinking, this looks a lot like another virus called Petya. After so many experts had looked at it, everybody was saying, no, this is not Petya. That's the clever, creative name that caught on. This is actually called now not Petya. But ultimately, this thing spread across the entire Maersk network, all of the machines. Within 2 hours, all 80,000 systems were disconnected from the network, either by choice or in most cases not by choice. As I said, the turnstiles were all shut down. All of the phones were locked up. They used voice over IP. Every single phone was encrypted. All the employees were sent home. 17 shipping ports around the world were completely shut down. One of the things that had happened that they described was, and probably there's experts in this room that would be able to describe this better than I could, but apparently there was a voice over IP system that stood at the ports, and as trucks came in, that voice over IP system would use to basically tell them of what they're picking up, where they're going, what they're hauling, basically doing a lot of logistics. Those were all shut down. There were miles of lines of trucks at all 17 of these ports doing absolutely nothing. Everything was shut down for them. So what about the backups? So at least we could back up, right? So it was interesting. Maersk did a fairly good job at backing up their servers, right? They were able to, they stood up an office, a war room, specifically in the UK, brought in all of their security and IT people, and then also brought in, I think about 300 people from, I want to say it was Deloitte, one of the big four. And their entire focus, their entire job was, how do we get back online? How do we get back in business as quickly as possible? So they're going through all of this. Basically, they didn't have any backups for the client machines, the laptops, the PCs, the employees' machines. So they needed to basically, they couldn't trust anything that was on any of these machines, so they had to wipe them. So their plan was, I'm going to essentially get a USB stick with a brand new operating system on that, and we're just going to run an assembly line, and we're going to plug it into each and every laptop and machine, and we're going to bring each of these machines back up. You've lost your data. If you had data on there, that's gone, but you can start to work again. Except they're in the middle of the UK, not in London, but somewhere in the middle of the UK, and you can't just go up to the local Best Buy and pick up 10,000 USB sticks that they would need, right? So this was going to take days. They're calling all over the place, trying to get as many of their USB sticks in so that they can then put the operating systems on there, so they can then set up the assembly lines, distribute everybody out to all of the offices and locations, and get machines up and running. That was for the employees' machines. The servers were better. They had backups for most of the servers. They dated anywhere from, at best, they were 3 days old, to at worst, they were 7 days old. So yeah, you were going to lose some data, but in the grand scheme of things, a server would come up that was essentially 7 days old in terms of the data that it had on it. Great. Except for something called the domain controllers. So what domain controllers do is they sit on the network, and they basically keep all of your usernames, all of your passwords, and everything that you have access to, right? So they didn't have an offline backup for those domain controllers, and there were hundreds of them across the company. However, the way domain controllers work is they have hot backups. They all back up each other, right? So if I have a domain controller here in Fort Worth, and there's another one in Chicago, they sync to each other, so Chicago can have the backup for Fort Worth can have the backup for Chicago, etc. Except because they are so fast, and because the speed of NotPetya proliferating across the network all the domain controllers were bricked and encrypted. So they didn't have any of that. So they're calling all around to all of their offices around the world, trying to figure out how are we going to recover these domain controllers, because even if I give you your machine and I install a new operating system, I have no idea what you're supposed to have access to, what your username and passwords were, all of that. So I still can't get any work done. So they're not having any luck until, luckily, they find there was a domain controller in Ghana. And something happened that's probably not terribly infrequent in Ghana. They had a massive power outage. They were down during this whole NotPetya outbreak. So they had a domain controller with access for the entire company because it backed up the domain controllers to there. Great news. All right, we're in the UK. We need to get somebody in the Ghana office to get the domain controller on a hard drive and fly them to the UK. Nobody in Ghana had a work visa for the UK. They could not get in. So the next thing happened. What they had to do was get one of the people in the office in Ghana, get it onto the domain controller onto a hard drive, fly to Nigeria. We had another person who was in the UK that flew to Nigeria. They gave them the hard drive in the airport, get back on the plane, fly back to the UK, and start the restore process in the UK. And they really did start to bring all this up. Now, by the way, I'm telling this story in a matter of minutes. This is days and days and days are going by where these folks are completely shut down. But what I wanted to talk about is the collateral damage here, because it wasn't just Maersk, right? There was a certain what I said was either it was intentional or it was sloppy. I think actually it was a little bit of both. Because when you look at all of the damage that was done across companies, and viruses don't know borders, right? It's not going to stop at Ukraine. It's going wherever that software is going. It's going wherever those networks are going. And you can see the White House estimates about $10 billion in damages. That's a total rough estimate. Merck, FedEx, Maersk, Mondelez, all of these folks suffered from NotPetya in very large, very damaging ways. But the reason why I think it was also just not completely intentional, but also sloppy, Russian banks got hit too, and they were out of it, right? There was this thing spread like wildfire, probably even much more than they thought when they hacked the update server for a piece of tax software in Ukraine. All of this damage worldwide over what started at essentially the TurboTax for Ukraine. And probably people in this room are familiar with this one. It continues today. We don't know that this is NotPetya. We don't actually know a ton yet about this in terms of what was publicly published, but they did publish the amount of damages that they suffered. Again, it's specific to this industry. They lost about $60 million in damages, 40 in lost shipping opportunities, and another 20 million in the response, the investigation, the forensics, and the recovery. $60 million. It happens more and more and more. In fact, we've been talking at Cisco, we talk a lot with some of the insurance providers. I've been talking with Marsh McLennan. I mean, not only are the rates going up on cyber insurance, in some cases, they've stopped taking policies. Okay, this is where we get to the weeds and the math. But I'm going to do this for a reason. And what we're going to talk about here is there's really three root causes to this breach. There was the vulnerabilities, right? Remember, both Eternal Blue and Mimikatz had essentially taken advantage of certain software vulnerabilities, in this case specific to Microsoft products, but I will tell you it happens to all software products, not just Microsoft. There was also the issue of authentication, right? Even if I am able to glean your username and password by using a tool like Mimikatz, if I have other controls in place, I still wouldn't be able to log into you. We'll talk a little bit about that. And then finally, the third piece is more on the recovery side. And it's some pretty basic stuff, but it's also very hard stuff. The reason I'm going to show you this research is to show you that all three of these things, certainly when I talk in my bubble of cybersecurity people out there, everybody's like, oh, why don't you just patch? Why don't you just fix your stuff, right? It's not that hard. It's incredibly hard. And the bigger the organization, the harder it actually is. So as I said, we published a bunch of joint research. If anyone's interested, that QR code will actually take you to the free download of all of this. We published it along with that Scientia Institute jointly. It's a whole bunch of information. It's super dense. Again, great nighttime reading if you're having trouble sleeping around security vulnerabilities. But this is why just patching your stuff isn't the answer. Remember, the Eternal Blue patch came out from Microsoft in March of 2017. WannaCry didn't start proliferating across the internet until May, right? So that's 2 months where they had the ability to patch their software and prevent that, but hadn't. Why? Well, what this chart looks at is essentially all the vulnerabilities that have been published year over year for the last 20 years. In fact, 2022 is not on here, but it's surpassed. It's the highest yet ever. There are millions of vulnerabilities. Within here, you're talking about hundreds of thousands of types, but imagine I'm Maersk, and I've got hundreds of thousands of machines, and they all have, I don't know, 10, 15, 20, 100 vulnerabilities. That means they are sitting on millions and millions of vulnerabilities. So, the good news is there's certain vulnerabilities that probably don't matter that much. In fact, most security vulnerabilities don't matter that much. According to our research and the data that we've looked at, of all of the vulnerabilities that have been published over the last 20 plus years, about 80% of them have never been exploited, never been attacked. There's no evidence of them ever causing any sort of damage. So that whittles it down to 20% that actually probably do matter, that do need to be taken care of. But there's another way of looking at this, right? So as I said, every single machine that I have, every laptop, every desktop, every server, every firewall, every router, every turnstile, they all have vulnerabilities on them. In fact, most of them, on average, we see have about 100 vulnerabilities on them at any given time, plus or minus for patching. So what that means, of those 100 vulnerabilities, what are the odds that one of them does matter, that one of them will be used in a breach like NotPetya, right? This is the chart, what you're looking at. What you really want to pay attention to is the red line. The blue line is all vulnerabilities, but we've already said all vulnerabilities don't matter, right? But those ones in red, those are the high-risk ones that we see. There is exploitations going on in the wild. There are things happening across the internet. They are being attacked. So if you look across, what we did is looked across hundreds of various firms, companies, enterprises out there and said, what are the odds of a machine having one of these high-risk vulnerabilities that could be attacked, right? And 75% of them, about 1 in 4 assets had them. But if you look down here, almost 20% of them, 75% of their machines had at least one of these vulnerabilities that could be taken advantage of. And when I say could be taken advantage of, that's not even including things like the zero-day vulnerabilities I talked about where there is no fix. This is almost 100% all patchable, fixable, published, public vulnerabilities that are out there, and in some cases have public exploits out there that people know about and have been published. Combine that with how fast people fix things. So on average, and this isn't terrible, right? About 50% of all vulnerabilities get fixed in the first month. But as you see that line goes out, it never gets to 0, right? It goes on in perpetuity forever. About 67% of them are remediated in the first 3 months. Again, let's think back to Eternal Blue. Published patch in March. The worm came out, the virus came out in May. So you're talking about somewhere between 50 and 65% of those patches went out, which means somewhere between 50 and 35% didn't get patched, right? That's a lot of machines in that time frame. It makes perfect sense why this took off. Again, we're gonna keep the math coming. Every blue dot here is a separate company, a separate organization. What we wanted to look at here was what was their capacity, their ability to actually fix these vulnerabilities. How many could an organization actually fix in a 1-month time frame? Again, patches come out monthly. We see actually the Eternal Blue was a typical example, not an atypical example. In fact, we see exploits, attacks, hacks come out for vulnerabilities. If they're going to come out at all, again, only 20% they ever come out. But for those 20%, they on average come out within 2 weeks of that vulnerability being published. What you're seeing here is, if I was to read this chart to you, everything here in the lower left are small companies, SMBs, right? And I say that because of the number of assets, the number of vulnerabilities that they're dealing with is low. It's in the single digits. The upper right is the opposite. These are Fortune 10, Fortune 100 organizations. Again, remember, this is on a monthly basis. They are, as you can see, like the biggest of the big, are dealing with 10 million new vulnerabilities every single month, and they're fixing about 1 million of those vulnerabilities, which means that 9 million of them are left open in a given month. What's remarkable to all the statisticians in the room is that red line. It's almost a perfect 45-degree angle. And what it's saying is, that is the median, by the way. What that means, essentially, is it doesn't matter the size of your organization. You could be the smallest company in the world. You could be the largest company in the world. You're fixing about 10% of your vulnerabilities a month, right? So being able to make sure that you fix the right 10%, the Eternal Blues, the Mimi Cats, is critical. And that's where these strategies come in. So I'm not going to go too deep into this. Time check, I think we got a little bit left. And I promise I save some time for Q&A, and if nobody has any questions, I will call on you. Ignore perfect info. What we did is we looked at a bunch of strategies, and we said, how good are these strategies at preventing the next NotPetya, right? How do I make sure that when I go out and fix something, it's worthwhile, and I didn't just waste my time fixing something that's never going to be attacked? I won't go to, there's a lot of jargon here. Effectively, a couple of things that I wanted to point out for this audience. Exploit code, perform the best. What that means is, hey, we already know there is an exploit for this, so let's go fix this. In other words, we already know Mimikatz exists. We already know Eternal Blue exists. Let's go fix this before we get hit by that. No surprise, that performed the best. These the blue, yellow, and red dots, I won't go too much into this either. Think of it as the capacity metrics we just looked at. We looked at that average of 10%. That's what yellow is. If you were an average company, if you were better than average, in other words, you could fix more for whatever reason. You had more automation, you had more people dedicated to it, whatever the case may be. That's your blue dot. Or if you're worse than average, that's your red dot. So what we're trying to say with this is, as you can see, the separation between the dots sometimes matters, right? Obviously, if you fix more, you'll be better. But if you work smarter, in other words, you pinpoint what you're going to fix, you can be way better than ever adding capacity, right? If you take nothing away from this slide, it's work smarter, not harder. So exploit code obviously was the best strategy going forward. An entertaining one is Twitter, compared to, probably nobody in this room knows what CVSS is, but it stands for the Common Vulnerability Scoring System. It is the #1 way in our industry today to prioritize what I'm going to fix on a 1 to 10 scale. It performed worse than if I just chose at random, essentially any vulnerability that got mentioned on Twitter, I fixed that first. Not a whole lot of strategy there, but it worked better than CVSS. And random is just that. I threw a dart at a dartboard, and that's what I fixed. So not much different, and the dotted line means do nothing. And then finally, why not both? So you do get benefits of doing both. Obviously, strategy is trumping capacity, meaning it's better to work smarter than work harder. But if you can do both, if you can put more resources into both, you'll actually see a 29x improvement if you decided, I'm just going to go after vulnerabilities that have exploit code, and I'm going to up my capacity. In other words, I'm going to put automation in, I'm going to put a patch management system in place, right? If I do those two things, I'm going to have a 29x better chance of preventing the next NotPetya from happening to my organization. That's what I want you to walk away with there. But there's a couple other things, and then we'll have our questions. So we talked about vulnerabilities. We talked about the key to fixing the right vulnerabilities. The other two things, multi-factor authentication, that's Duo, but whatever. There's a million different ways to use multi-factor authentication. You'll hear people in the security circle start to say, well, don't use SMS texts for multi-factor authentication because there's holes in it. I agree, there are holes in it, but it's better than not using it. It is 100% better than not using it. So wherever you can use multi-factor authentication, use it. It prevents the Mimikatz, right? So if I scrape all of your usernames and passwords off of the machine and I go to try and log into you, you're going to get a notification, text, push notification, whatever. Decline it. I don't get in. MFA prevents that. And then finally, offline backups matter, not just for your servers, especially for your domain controllers and all of your laptops. And I do mean offline. It's great to have hot backups. That works fantastic for a standard disaster recovery process. And it certainly works well in terms of load balancing and traffic and things like that. But as we saw from Maersk, if I don't have an offline backup, I got to hope that I had a power outage in Ghana at the same time. There is one more piece of security advice that I would give to everybody. Doesn't necessarily in any way have to do with what happened at Maersk, what happened at FedEx, what happened to these other companies. But if I'm ever talking to anybody about, well, what are the simplest things that I can do in order to improve my security posture? We talked about these two things. We talked about vulnerability management. We went into a lot of depth, I'll admit, on vulnerability management. The real answer there is if you have auto update, enable it, right? If fixes are available, if patches become updates available, I know they're a pain in the butt. You're going to sit there and wait on your reboot of your machine and everything else. Run it offline, do it whenever you can, but patch those. But the other thing that has nothing to do with any of this, but I highly recommend, is using a password manager. I don't care which one. There's a bunch of them out there, 1Password, LastPass, all of these. But effectively, it allows you to not know or care what your passwords are, but use very big, long, strong passwords that you don't even know. I have it on my phone. I have it on my laptop. When I go to log in, I just click my 1Password. It logs in for me. My password is probably between 40 and 50 characters long, and it's different on every single website and every different application. I don't have to write it down. It's all part of that. I highly recommend. Those are the things more than anything else that are simple to do that will really improve your security. So with that, I'm going to open it up to questions. Thank you. I'm sorry? Oh yeah, so password manager. I personally use 1Password, but if you want to use LastPass, I forget all the names, just look up Google Password Manager, and there's a bunch of them that are out there. I would highly recommend it.
Know
So that's a great one. So I didn't get into it in this presentation. I believe it was someone from the U.S. government went into Ukraine and confiscated those servers in the update servers for MEDOX, and did a forensic analysis to find out who it was, and they certainly didn't know in advance that it was coming. They certainly did know these attacks happen all the time, and they certainly did know, and I think they even stated out there publicly, which is a kind of a rare thing for them to do, and warned about the attacks from Russia on Ukraine, specifically in cyber. They actually know roughly which office in Russia did this, but you can't go in and arrest them or anything like that. Yeah, send John Wayne in. I wouldn't say there's necessarily a single time of year. There are events that take place that get taken advantage of. You see this especially on the social engineering and phishing side of the house, right? Something happens in the news, and immediately you see a bunch of phishers and stuff going after that topic and trying to take advantage of you in some way for that. Obviously, so I mentioned the NSA catalog and things like that. What we didn't talk about is that's very common, right? So one of the things, there are actually companies out there who develop what they call capabilities. These capabilities are effectively hacks against types of software, right? And they sell them to governments. So NSA has their capabilities, Russia has their capabilities, North Korea, China, Iran, all of these countries have a long list of capabilities that they've either developed or they've acquired. So the one thing I would throw out there is there's targeted attacks and targets of opportunity. If you are a targeted attack of a government, get help. Usually get help from in this case, from the US government, because the amount of resources, time, and capabilities that they have is probably way more than you have. But what you will be able to do is prevent the target of opportunity. We talked about those vulnerabilities. We talked about the spray and pray nature of all this stuff that's going across the internet. But if I was patched, I would never have gotten hit. I wouldn't have been collateral damage in that slide. One more. Go ahead. That's a great question. So the question, I'll repeat it and hopefully I understand it correctly. There's the challenge of there's more and more connectedness. There's IoT and IT, et cetera. There's also all of these companies that are connected together either through partnerships. There's actually some things coming out of the US government, an organization called CISA, which stands for I forget. It's basically out of the Department of Defense. And what they have recommended for some of these things, the technical term is SBOM, or Software Bill of Materials. So as you're building this supply chain, if you will, of software, it serves as an ingredients list, right? So I can look at that software and I can see all of the ingredients. And it's important, not only because then I know what all the weaknesses, the security weaknesses are in that software, but if you think about the way software is developed today and the interconnectedness of it all, if I was to look at any given software development shop, I would bet 90% of what goes into their software was actually not written by their developers, right? The open source, all these libraries, everything that kind of comes together to build this software application. So knowing what's in there, knowing the vulnerabilities, that's a good step. Obviously with IoT, that presents a new challenge as well. And probably the thing with IoT is it also introduces operational risk, right? So we start to see things like, It's one thing if I take your laptop down to install updates and patches, I can't necessarily take down this assembly line to do the same thing, right? So there's challenges on that. So there's a lot of people that are working on the IoT space specifically, and it's very unique to each device, whether it be in healthcare or manufacturing or logistics or wherever. It's a big challenge, but there's a lot. The good news is there's a lot of people working on that right now. Okay, well thank you very much. I really appreciate your time.